In September of 1961, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Pfeiffer paid $40 for a 1948 Farmall M that had not moved under its own power in 6 years. The auctioneer almost didn't list it. He walked past it twice during the preview, clipboard in hand, and the second time he stopped and looked at it the way a man looks at something he is embarrassed to be associated with. The hood was gone, not misplaced. Gone, sold for scrap 3 years prior by the previous owner's son, who needed $14 and saw no reason to be sentimental about it. The magneto had been stripped. Both rear tires were flat and had been flat long enough that the rubber had begun to crack along the sidewalls in a pattern that looked like dried creek mud. A family of starlings had nested in the air cleaner stack, and the nest was still there, packed tight with grass and mud, and 3 years of accumulated debris. The front axle had a visible bend in it that nobody had bothered to explain. The drawbar was missing. The seat was missing. There was a crack running 6 inches along the top of the block that someone had attempted to repair with radiator stop leak and optimism, neither of which had worked. When the auctioneer finally listed it, he said, "We got a 48M here, gentlemen. She's a parts machine or a conversation piece. Take your pick. Who'll start me at 20. A scrap dealer from Marshalltown bid 25. He was the only bidder for 45 seconds. Then Lorene Pfeiffer raised her hand and said 30. The scrap dealer said 35. Lorene said 40. The scrap dealer looked at the cracked block and the missing hood and the starling nest and decided the iron wasn't worth the argument. The auctioneer said sold and wrote Lorene's name in his book and moved on to a set of disc blades before anyone had time to process what had just happened. Her brother-in-law, Cleet Vogel, was standing 6 feet away. He waited until the auctioneer was well clear, and then he said, "Lorene, what in the world are you going to do with that?" She said, "Fix it." He said, "Fix it how? The block is cracked." She said, "Not that block." He didn't know what that meant. Neither did anyone else at the sale that day. By the following week, the story had made its way from the liquidation site to Grundy Center Feed and Supply, and from the feed store to the Farmers Cooperative elevator on the south end of town, and from the elevator to Mabel's Diner on 3rd Street, where it was repeated over coffee with the particular embellishment that accumulates when a story travels through a farming county in the fall of the year. The version at the diner had Lorene paying $60, which was wrong, and had the Farmall missing its engine entirely, which was almost right, and had her planning to use it as a planter, which was not right at all. The version that reached the church parking lot after services the following Sunday had her paying $80, and had her brother-in-law shaking his head so hard his hat fell off, which was apocryphal, but spiritually accurate. Grundy County laughed at Lorene Pfeiffer for the better part of 3 months. They stopped laughing in 1974. But we'll get there. Let me tell you about Lorene Pfeiffer, because what she did with that Farmall M only makes sense if you understand who she was. And who she was only makes sense if you understand her father. Lorene was born in 1930 on a 240-acre farm, 4 miles northeast of Grundy Center, the second of 4 children, and the only one who showed any interest in the machine shed. Her father, August Pfeiffer, had come to Grundy County from Wisconsin in 1921 with a second-hand tractor, a set of machinist tools he'd carried in a wooden crate on the back of a truck, and a philosophy about money that he had arrived at through 2 decades of watching other men lose things they thought they owned. August had apprenticed at a machine shop in Oshkosh before the First War, and had spent the years between the wars applying that training to every piece of equipment on his farm and every piece of equipment on his neighbors' farms, usually for a modest fee, and sometimes for nothing at all, depending on the year and the neighbor. His shop was a concrete-floored building behind the house that he had poured himself in 1924, with a tin roof that drummed in the rain, and a cast-iron wood stove in the corner that he fired from October through April. The workbench ran the full length of the north wall and was built from 2-inch oak planking that August had milled himself from a stand of timber he'd cleared in 1922. Above the bench, tools hung on wooden pegs in an order that August had established and never varied. Wrenches by size left to right, sockets in their indexed holder, taps and dies in their numbered case, files in their rack, micrometers and calipers in their wooden boxes, lined with felt that August had cut himself from a scrap of wool blanket. The South Bend lathe against the east wall had come from the Oshkosh shop when it closed in 1935, and August had paid $60 for it and hauled it home on a borrowed flatbed. He kept the ways oiled and the chuck jaws clean, and the cutting tool ground to an angle he'd determined through 30 years of practice, and had written down in a notebook that he kept on a shelf above the lathe, next to a copy of Machinery's Handbook with his own annotations in the margins. August Pfeiffer did not borrow money. This was not a religious conviction, and it was not a political position. It was an arithmetic conviction. He had watched the county's farms change hands in the early 1930s, and he had done the math on what had happened to each one, and the math was consistent. The farms that were lost were the farms that carried debt, and the farms that survived were the farms that didn't. He had been fortunate enough to inherit his land clear of any mortgage from his own father, and he had made it the organizing principle of his operation that it would remain that way. Every piece of equipment he owned was paid for. Every improvement he made was funded from the previous year's margin. When the margin was thin, the improvement waited. When the margin was good, the improvement was modest, because August did not trust good margins to repeat themselves. He taught Lorene to run the lathe when she was 12, not as a novelty, not as an experiment, because she asked, and because he saw in the way she asked that she would take it seriously. By the time she was 15, she could turn a shaft to within 0.02 of an inch and thread it to a tolerance that August said was better than what the shop in Oshkosh had demanded of its journeymen. She learned to read a micrometer before she learned to drive. She learned to identify an engine family by its bore, spacing before she could name the governors of the surrounding states. She had a scholarship offer from Iowa State in 1948, agricultural economics. She had a suitcase half-packed and a bus ticket purchased and a plan that involved leaving Grundy County and not coming back for a long time. Then her mother had a stroke in July of that year, and Lorene unpacked the suitcase and put the bus ticket in the kitchen drawer and didn't mention it again, not bitterly, not as a sacrifice she cataloged for others. She simply made a decision and moved forward, which was a thing August Pfeiffer had raised her to do. She ran the farm alongside her father through the 1950s, taking on more of the operation each year as August's hands gave him trouble. He died in March of 1959 at the age of 71 of a heart attack that came on a Tuesday morning while he was banking the wood stove in the shop. The county came to the funeral. The county said kind things. Lorene thanked them and went back to work. She inherited 240 acres clear of any debt. She inherited $14,200 in a savings account at the Grundy Center State Bank, accumulated over 30 years of margins that August had considered sufficient to save, but not sufficient to spend. She inherited the shop, the lathe, the tools, the notebooks, and the philosophy. She was 29 years old, and she had no partners, no mortgage, and no intention of acquiring either. Now, the Farmall M. When Lorene looked at that cracked block and those flat tires and that missing hood in September of 1961, she did not see what everyone else saw. Here is what everyone else saw: a parts machine worth $35 in scrap iron, and perhaps another $20 in salvageable castings, assuming you wanted to spend an afternoon pulling them. Here is what Lorene saw: a frame, a transmission, a rear axle, a set of final drives, and a hydraulic system, all of which were sound, all of which were compatible with an engine she had already acquired, and all of which could be made to work for a total cost that she had already calculated on a piece of graph paper in her kitchen 3 weeks before the liquidation sale was announced. That is the part nobody in Grundy County knew. That is the part that changes the story entirely. In June of 1961, 3 months before the liquidation sale, Lorene had driven to a construction equipment salvage yard outside of Waterloo and paid $65 for a Perkins P4 diesel engine that had come out of a condemned skid loader. The engine had 1,400 hours on it, and a cracked injector line and a fuel pump that needed rebuilding, none of which concerned her. The block was sound. The head was sound. The crankshaft had been measured and was within spec. She had driven to Waterloo specifically because she had read about the Perkins P4 in an agricultural engineering bulletin that her father had subscribed to, and that she had continued to receive after his death. And she had spent 2 evenings with a set of calipers and her father's machinery's handbook working out whether the engine's bolt pattern could be adapted to the Farmall M's bell housing. It could. She had already drawn the adapter plate. She had known about the Pfeiffer farm liquidation for 2 months before the sale. She had driven past the property and looked at the M sitting in the fence line, and she had taken measurements of the rear axle width and the drawbar mount and the hydraulic pump housing, and she had confirmed what she already suspected. The M's drivetrain was exactly what she needed, and $40 was a reasonable price for it. And the cracked block was irrelevant because she was going to remove it anyway. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Lorene Pfeiffer proved that a machinist builds what she needs, and a buyer pays for what someone else decided to build. She pulled the cracked block out of the M the first weekend of October 1961, working alone in her father's shop with the chain hoist that August had hung from the center beam in 1938 and never replaced because it had never needed replacing. The Farmall's frame went up on stands. She spent 3 evenings assessing what was salvageable. The transmission was tight. The rear axle bearings were good. The hydraulic pump turned freely and held pressure when she tested it with a hand pump and a gauge. The final drives were worn but serviceable. The front axle had the bend she'd seen at the sale, and she straightened it on the 3rd Saturday of October using the shop press and a measurement she'd taken from a known good M at the implement dealer in town, who let her measure his floor model without asking too many questions. The Perkins P4 came off the shop floor and onto the engine stand in early November. She pulled the injector lines, found the cracked one, ordered a replacement from a Perkins distributor in Des Moines for $4.70. She rebuilt the fuel pump herself using a kit she'd sourced from the same distributor for $11. She cleaned the injectors in the parts washer, had them tested and calibrated at a diesel shop in Waterloo for $8 for the set. She replaced the head gasket, the valve stem seals, the oil pan gasket, and the rear main seal. She replaced the water pump impeller. She replaced the thermostat. She painted the block with engine enamel she mixed herself from a formula her father had written in one of the notebooks. The adapter plate was the work that took the most time. She had drawn it in June. She machined it in December, working evenings after chores, standing at her father's lathe in a shop heated to 45 degrees by the wood stove, wearing her father's canvas shop coat over her barn clothes. The plate was 3/8 inch mild steel, 8 inches in diameter, with a bolt pattern on one face matched to the Perkins P4's flywheel housing, and a bolt pattern on the other face matched to the Farmall M's bell housing. The pilot bore she turned to a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch. She checked it with the inside micrometer her father had bought in 1941 and kept in its wooden case on the shelf above the lathe. The cutting oil was still in the reservoir. She refilled it and got to work. The plate fit on the first trial. She had not expected otherwise. Total costs, in the order she acquired them: Farmall M frame and drivetrain, $40. Perkins P4 engine, $65. Injector line, $4.70. Fuel pump rebuild kit, $11. Injector calibration, $8. Head gasket set and engine seals, $14.20. Water pump impeller, $3. Adapter plate steel, $7.50. Transmission seals and bearings, $19. Front axle straightening consumables, $2. Hydraulic seal kit, $6. Tires, 2 used rear tires, sourced from a neighbor's retired tractor, $20. Seat, salvaged from a scrapped Oliver at the Waterloo yard on the same trip as the Perkins, $8. Drawbar, fabricated from bar stock in her father's shop, $4 in material. Electrical, fuel line, and hardware, $18. Miscellaneous, $9.60. Total, $240. The Grundy Center Farm Equipment dealer's price for a new Farmall, 4.60 diesel that fall, was $4,200. Lorene did not have a payment on the $4,200 tractor. She had a $240 tractor that she owned outright, and she had the $4,000 she had not spent sitting in the Grundy Center State Bank, earning 3.5% interest. She finished the assembly in the last week of January 1962. She had been working evenings and weekends for 4 months, fitting the build around the rhythms of a farm that did not stop requiring attention because she had a project in the shop. She primed the fuel system on a Thursday evening. She bled the injectors on Friday. On Saturday morning, with the temperature outside at 18 degrees and the wood stove having been burning since 5 in the morning, she climbed onto the fabricated seat, set the throttle, and engaged the starter. The Perkins turned over 4 times and caught. The exhaust note that came out of the stack she had fabbed from pipe stock was not the note of a Farmall M. It was heavier, lower, more deliberate. The sound of a 4-cylinder diesel finding its idle after a cold start, settling into a rhythm that was different from anything a gasoline Farmall had ever produced from the factory. She let it warm for 20 minutes, watching the oil pressure gauge she had mounted to the instrument panel, watching the temperature gauge climb to operating range and hold. She listened to the valve train. She listened to the injectors, She listened to the way the idle changed when she advanced the throttle and the way it recovered when she brought it back. Everything was where it was supposed to be. She put it in gear and drove it out of the shop and across the frozen yard to the fuel tank and filled it. Then she drove it back into the shop and shut it off and went inside and ate breakfast. She did not call anyone. She did not drive to the feed store. She wrote the final cost figures in a ledger she kept in the kitchen and added the total and noted the date and turned to the next page. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone, watch them laugh at a purchase and miss the plan entirely, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one is just getting started. Word got out the way word always gets out in a county of 300 farms, not through Lorene, who said nothing, but through a neighbor named Harold Stange, who ran 180 acres on the section to Lorene's east, and who had been skeptical of the farmal purchase in the specific way that men who consider themselves practical are skeptical of things they don't understand. Harold had made a comment at the feed store in October that had been repeated with approval. He had made a similar comment at the elevator in November. He was, in the taxonomy of Grundy County opinion, a reliable voice of conventional wisdom, and his conventional wisdom on the subject of Lorene Pfeiffer's $40 tractor had been consistent and dismissive. In April of 1962, Harold Stange came to Lorene's fence line on a Tuesday afternoon and watched her work the south field with the converted M, pulling a three-bottom plow through ground that was still carrying moisture from a wet March. He stood at the fence for a long time. Then he walked back to his truck and drove home. He came back the next morning and stood at the fence again, and this time Lorene saw him and brought the tractor around to where he was standing and shut it off. Harold took his cap off and looked at the engine compartment, which still had no hood, because Lorene had not yet fabricated one, and he could see the Perkins clearly. He looked at the adapter plate. He looked at the injector lines. He looked at the exhaust stack. He rubbed the back of his neck with his cap still in his hand. He said, "What is that engine?" She said, "Perkins, P4. Diesel." He said, "Where'd you get it?" She said, "Waterloo." He said, "That plate in the middle, you make that." She said she did. He put his cap back on and looked at the tractor for another moment, and then he said, "Your father would have liked that." Lorene said she thought so too. Harold went back to his truck and drove to the Grundy Center farm equipment dealer that afternoon and told the dealer what he'd seen. The dealer drove out to Lorene's farm the following Saturday and spent 40 minutes looking at the conversion, asking questions that Lorene answered in the fewest words that would convey the necessary information. The dealer was a man named Vic Remmert, who had been selling equipment in Grundy County for 15 years and who had a practiced ability to assess machinery quickly and accurately. He assessed this one carefully. He looked at the adapter plate for a long time. When he left, he told 2 other farmers what he'd seen, and the way he told it was different from the way the story had traveled in the fall. In the fall, the story had been about a woman who'd done something foolish. Now it was about a woman who'd done something that Vic Remmert, who knew engines, said he wouldn't have believed if he hadn't looked at the plate himself. Farmers telling other farmers something they had seen with their own eyes. That kind of story travels differently. It doesn't gain embellishment. It gains weight. Lorene did not notice the difference. She had 240 acres to farm. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 12 years, because this is where the story stops being about a tractor and starts being about something else entirely. The converted M worked not adequately. Well, the Perkins P4 produced more torque at low RPM than the gasoline engine it replaced, which meant the tractor pulled more consistently in heavy ground and used less fuel doing it. Lorene tracked her fuel costs in the ledger the same way she tracked everything else, and the diesel fuel cost per acre was lower than the gasoline cost had been, and the difference compounded over 12 years of corn and soybeans and the occasional oat crop into a number that was not trivial. She also tracked her repair costs, which were low, because she had rebuilt the machine from the frame up and knew every component in it and could address problems before they became failures. She saved the difference. Not in a dramatic or deliberate way, in the way her father had saved, which was to spend what the operation required and put the rest in the bank and not think about it as anything other than arithmetic. By 1968, 7 years after the auction, she had $31,000 in the Grundy Center State Bank. By 1972, she had $54,000. She had not borrowed a dollar in that time. She had not taken on a partner. She had not expanded recklessly or contracted fearfully. She had farmed 240 acres the way August Pfeiffer had taught her to farm. 240 acres, which was carefully and without debt, and with a ledger that told her the truth about her operation at all times. The converted M was still her primary tractor. She had fabricated a hood for it in the winter of 1963 from sheet steel she bought at a metal supplier in Waterloo, and bent on a brake she borrowed from a neighbor for a weekend. It fit well enough. It was not pretty. It was functional, which was the standard she applied to everything. You know what happened to American agriculture in the early 1970s. You know about the Soviet grain deal and the commodity price spike and the way the extension offices and the farm lenders and the agricultural economists all said the same thing at the same time, which was, get big or get out. You know about the land values that doubled and then doubled again, and the operating loans that seemed reasonable when corn was $3 a bushel, and seemed like a different kind of document entirely when corn fell back below 2. You know what happened when the Federal Reserve raised rates to break inflation in 1979 and 1980, and you know what the prime rate was in 1981, which was 21.5%, and you know what a farm operation built on borrowed land and borrowed equipment and borrowed operating capital looked like when it was carrying debt at 21.5% and selling corn at prices that hadn't recovered. Grundy County lost 11 farms between 1981 and 1986. Lorene knew most of the families. The Benner place, 320 acres, went to the bank in the spring of 1982. Dale Benner had expanded in 1974 and again in 1977, borrowing against land values that the bank had been happy to appraise upward and equally unhappy to reappraise downward. The Schreiber operation, 480 acres assembled over a decade of optimistic credit, went in 1983. The Hollenbeck brothers, who had bought their father's farm from the estate, rather than inheriting it clear, lost it in the winter of 1984, after 2 years of trying to service a note that the operation could not support at any commodity price that existed in the real world. Lorene watched this happen not with satisfaction, but with the quiet sadness of someone who had understood the arithmetic for a long time and had no pleasure in seeing it confirmed. She knew these families. She had gone to school with some of them. She had bought grain from them and sold seed to them and stood next to them at the co-op and the diner and the church parking lot. She did not say, "I told you so," because she had never told them anything. She had simply done something different, and the difference was now visible in a way that was painful to observe. Her expenses in 1982 were the same as her expenses in 1979. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She owned her land. She owned her equipment. She had no operating loan. Her input costs were real, and she managed them carefully. But there was no debt service to carry, no balloon payment coming due, no banker to call. She farmed through the crisis the way she had farmed before it, carefully with a ledger on land she owned outright. In the spring of 1983, the Benner place went to auction. The 320 acres were good ground. Lorene knew every field. She had farmed adjacent to the Benner property for 20 years, and she knew the soil and the drainage and the way the north field held moisture in a wet spring, and the way the south field produced in a dry one. The opening bid at the auction was set at $800 an acre, which was below what the land had been valued at in 1979, and above what some of the speculators in the crowd thought it was worth in the current market. There were investors from Des Moines. There were 2 farm consolidation operations that had been moving through the county, buying distressed land. There was a local banker who was bidding on behalf of an undisclosed principal. Lorene stood near the back of the crowd and waited. The bidding opened at $800 and moved in $50 increments to $950, where 2 of the outside bidders dropped away. At $1,000 an acre, it was down to the local banker and one of the consolidation operations and Lorene. At $1,050, the consolidation operation dropped out. At $1,100, it was Lorene and the banker went to $1,150, and Lorene said $1,200. The banker paused. He looked at Lorene. He had known her for 20 years. He knew her account balance. He bid $1,250. Lorene bid $1,300. The banker thought about it for a long moment, and then he shook his head and stepped back. 320 acres at $1,300 an acre. $416,000. She wrote a check. The crowd went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something happens that requires everyone present to rearrange what they thought they knew. Not the quiet of disapproval, not the quiet of surprise exactly, the quiet of recalibration, the quiet of a county that had laughed at a $40 tractor in 1961 and was now watching the woman who bought it write a check for $416,000 in cash for the best ground in the township. Cleet Vogel was in the crowd. Her brother-in-law, who had asked her what in the world she was going to do with that farm 22 years earlier, he didn't say anything. He looked at the check, and he looked at Lorene, and he looked at the ground, and then he walked to his truck. Vic Remmert, the dealer who had driven out to look at the adapter plate in 1962, was also there. He found Lorene after the auction and shook her hand and said, "Your father was a hell of a machinist." She said, "Yes, he was." He said, "So are you." She said, "Thank you," and went to sign the paperwork. Lorene farmed 560 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. The converted M was retired in 1979, not because it had failed, but because the operation had grown enough to require more horsepower, and she had purchased a used diesel tractor with cash and serviced it herself. The M sat in the corner of the shop under a canvas tarp. She did not sell it. She did not scrap it. It had cost her $240, and had worked for 17 years, and she saw no reason to be casual about something like that. August Pfeiffer's shop was still standing. The lathe was still running. The tools were still on their pegs in the order August had established, because Lorene had maintained that order for 30 years and saw no reason to change it. The notebooks were still on the shelf. The machinery's handbook was still there, with August's annotations in the margins, and now Lorene's annotations below his in a different ink. Her niece, Carol Vogel, Cleet's daughter, which was its own kind of irony, started coming to the shop on Saturday mornings in 1986, when she was 14. She had asked if she could learn to run the lathe. Lorene had looked at her for a moment and then said yes, for the same reason August had said yes to Lorene, because of the way she asked and because she would take it seriously. By the time Carol was 16, she could turn a shaft to within 0.02 of an inch, which was the standard Lorene had learned from August and had not lowered for anyone. In the fall of 1989, Lorene was asked to speak at the Grundy County Farm Bureau annual meeting. She was not a natural public speaker, and she did not pretend to be. She stood at the front of the room and said what she had to say in the plainest language she could find, which was the only kind of language she trusted. She said, "I bought a tractor in 1961 for $40. People thought I'd lost my mind. I put a diesel engine in it that I bought for $65 and machined the adapter myself in my father's shop. The whole conversion cost me $240. A new tractor that year was $4,200. The difference between $240 and $4,200 is $3,960. I put that in the bank. I did that every time I had the choice between buying something and building something. I did it with equipment, and I did it with inputs, and I did it with every decision I made on that farm for 28 years. And when the crisis came and the Benner ground went to auction, I had the money to buy it because I had never spent money I didn't have on things I didn't need to buy." She paused and looked at the room. She said, "A paid-for farm and paid-for equipment are the only things a bank cannot take from you. Everything else is just borrowing time." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Cleet Vogel came to the farm the following spring. He was 61 years old, and his own operation had survived the crisis by a margin he did not discuss in detail. And he stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at the lathe and the tools on their pegs, and Carol at the workbench doing something with a file and a piece of bar stock. He said, "Your father would have been proud of what you built here." Lorene said, "He built it. I just kept it going." Cleet said, "That's not nothing," she said. "No, it isn't. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a 1948 Farmall M with a cracked block and flat tires and a starling nest in the air cleaner stack? Most people see scrap iron. Most people see $35 in salvageable castings and an afternoon's work pulling them. Most people see exactly what the auctioneer saw when he walked past it twice with his clipboard and almost didn't list it. Lorene Pfeiffer saw a frame and a transmission and a rear axle and a hydraulic system, and she saw a Perkins P4 diesel she had already bought, and she saw an adapter plate she had already drawn, and she saw 240 acres of debt-free ground that would compound every dollar she saved into something a bank could not reach. That's the difference between a buyer and a builder. A buyer pays for what someone else decided to make. A builder finds the shortest distance between what exists and what is needed, and she walks it herself, with her father's tools and her father's arithmetic. in a shop that smells like cutting oil and wood smoke, in a county that laughed for 3 months and then went quiet for the rest of its life. $40, a Grundy County liquidation sale, a machinist's daughter who saw what nobody else bothered to look for. The farmal nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood until the day she wrote the check. Say,